Okay, so last little bit here of the biological matrix of inquiry. So Dewey begins our conclusion. I close with a reference to a predicament in which both organic behavior and deliberate inquiry are caught. And recall that this whole chapter, this whole first part of the book has been, and one of the main points of the book is the kind of historical grounding of inquiry in organic biology and biological behavior, and how inquiry develops out of natural processes, natural organic processes. So a predicament in which both organic behavior and deliberate inquiry are caught. There always exists a discrepancy between means that are employed and consequences that ensue. So there's some gap, some difference, or some disjunction between the means that we use to accomplish something and what actually happens, the consequences that result. Sometimes this discrepancy is so serious that its result is what we call mistake and error. So here he's giving a little hint about where error comes from, why errors exist. Once we figure out how to do something, then it seems like, well, maybe it should seem like, then we know how to do it. It should just always keep working in that way forever and ever. But, of course, that's not really what happens. There's a discrepancy between what we have learned how to do and then what happens when we actually do it. The discrepancy exists, Dewey tells us. It exists because the means used, the organs and habits of biological behavior, and the organs and conceptions employed in deliberate inquiry must be present and actual, while consequences to be attained are future. So time matters. The process of something occurring over time matters. It affects what happens. And it affects the utility of things. Things change, right? Change matters here. So the means used, the techniques we use to accomplish something, habits, organs, concepts in inquiry, these are all things that are present, exist in the present, but the consequences that they are used to enact, of course, occur in the future. Present actual means are the result of past conditions and past activities, right? So the organs, the habits, the concepts, these have resulted from past conditions, from past acts in past conditions. They operate successfully, so those organs and behaviors and habits and so on, concepts, they operate successfully or rightly in, one, the degree in which existing environing conditions are very similar to those which contributed in the past to formation of the habits, and two, in the degree in which habits retain enough flexibility to readapt themselves easily to new conditions. Right? So the present means are successful in these two cases, or may be successful in these two cases, operate rightly in these two cases. In the case that the conditions, the present conditions are similar to the past conditions, or in the case that the habits are, flexible enough that they can easily adapt to the new conditions. The latter condition, so the condition in which habits are flexible enough, have a certain amount of flexibility, the latter condition is not readily fulfilled by lower organisms, by kind of organisms lower than, say, animals, or talk about the higher animals. Sometimes we talk about the higher animals, maybe like horses and dogs and dolphins and stuff, and then you have lower organisms, maybe worms and bacteria and stuff like that. But we don't need to get too technical about it. But there's a difference in flexibility of behavior among maybe different complexities of organism. When it is fulfilled, a case of evolution occurs. So when habit becomes more flexible, then evolution, quote unquote evolution, occurs. The potential conditions for its fulfillment are present in the activities of human beings in much larger measure. Of flexibility of habit, the condition for having flexible habits are more present in human beings, are more available in human beings, but the inertial phase of habit is strong. So the tendency of habit to just keep going, to do the same thing in new situations that seem to be like old situations. The inertial phase of habit is strong, and so far as it is yielded to, human beings continue to live upon a relatively animal plane in terms of animal habits. Even the history of science has been marked by epochs in which observation and reflection have operated only within a predetermined conceptual framework. An example of the inertial phase of habit. So science can go on, maybe not so effectively, but when science can kind of get stuck in habit as well. It's not just a matter of kind of everyday habits, but institutions get into this kind of rigid condition where they just seem to persist through habit and are not so able to adapt to changes in circumstance. So I like this idea of inertia, maybe a metaphor that we're applying to habit. Habit has a kind of inertial aspect to it, where it tends to keep going unless you have reason to reflect on it and change it. Let's see where I am. I think I am here. So the only way to avoid and avert the mistakes of this fixation is by recognition of the provisional and conditional nature, as respects any inquiry in process, of the facts that enter into it, and the hypothetical nature of the conceptions and theories employed is a relatively late discovery. So another kind of complicated sentence. So the way to avoid the mistakes of kind of fixation in habit is by recognizing that the facts on which the habit is based are provisional and conditional. So they're temporary, they're context dependent, they're not eternal, right? They can change. The circumstances can change in subtle ways. Things that, an object that seems to be the same might have a different meaning in a new situation, right? The context around it changes, and you should no longer take it as the same sort of thing. You can no longer rely on habit to respond to it in the correct way or in an effective way. So that's our way to avoid mistakes, errors stemming from habit, is recognizing that a new situation is a new situation, is in fact a new situation, and recognizing the hypothetical nature of the conceptions and theories employed. So we always have to recognize that a theory is hypothetical. That sounds weird a little bit. I mean, there is a difference between theory and hypothesis. But the point is that when you attain knowledge, that knowledge is context dependent. When you obtain a new kind of knowing, that is always kind of tied to the context in which the knowing takes place. And after that point, it then becomes a hypothesis. So the knowledge is not then eternal. It just becomes something you can maybe take for granted, but that taking for granted does not mean that it's assured. You always have to kind of keep in the back of your mind that it's still a hypothesis, that this bit of knowledge that you seem to have is really in the future, in kind of the succeeding situations, it has the status of an hypothesis. So it may not always work. You always have to kind of re-verify it in order it to still count as knowledge, if that makes sense. And this was, as he says, a relatively late discovery, discovering that we have to treat facts as provisional, as hypothetical. The meaning of the discovery has hardly penetrated yet into inquiry about the subjects of the greatest practical importance to man, religion, politics, and morals. Yeah, there we tend to have kind of this essentialize our facts, right? We tend to think morality is something eternal. There's a definite right or wrong, definite good or bad, and maybe we need to be a little bit more flexible and notice how our morality in fact changes under different historical circumstances. There's been a lot of interesting work about that. I won't go into it here, but that was an important point in Dewey's work on ethics, is that different ways of moralizing occur under different historical conditions. Anyway, going on here to finish up this last page, I believe. Just checking out where I am. Okay, a couple more paragraphs, I guess. Don't want to get ahead of myself. All right, so, yes, penultimate paragraph here, I believe. The recognition of what Peirce called fallibilism, in distinction from infallibilism, is something more than a prudential maxim. So fallibilism, this is an important pragmatist concept. Not only pragmatist, but they were especially maybe influential or enthusiastic about the idea of fallibilism, that we are fallible, that our knowledge, so-called knowledge, is fallible, that our principles are fallible. They can be wrong. In distinction from infallibilism, the idea that certain things are always necessarily true. So the recognition of fallibilism is more than like a convenient thing to think. It results of necessity from the possibility and probability of a discrepancy between means available for use and consequences that follow. So fallibilism follows from. It's not just something that it's convenient to keep in mind that we are fallible. Obviously, human beings are fallible, but it's kind of a necessary entailment from the fact that means are something developed from the past and available in the present, but the future is what it is, and there's a discrepancy between the present means developed through the past and what will happen through employment of those means in the future. So discrepancy between past and future conditions, not from mere weakness of mortal powers. So we're not fallible just because we're mortal, but because things change, right? And so what worked in the past doesn't necessarily work as you expect in the future. Because we live in a world in process, the future, although continuous with the past, is not its bare repetition. The future is not a repetition of the past. The principle applies with peculiar force to inquiry about inquiry, including, needless to say, the inquiry presented in this treatise. The very words which must be used are words that have had their meanings fixed in the past to express ideas that are unlike those which they must now convey if they are to express what is intended. This is an interesting point about language, right? Language is a means, and it was developed through past experiences, through solving past problems, through trying to get across things in the past, through trying to make sense of our situation in the past. And so this past developed means available to us now to try to communicate new things, but because they were developed in order to, in past circumstances, in older circumstances, they are maybe not so adaptable, right? We need to kind of keep in mind that they were developed in past conditions and maybe useful in past conditions, but they may have drawbacks because in terms of trying to express new ideas, right? Their meanings were fixed in the past to express ideas, certain kinds of ideas, but those ideas might be opposed to ideas which we want to express now, right? So that is something we need to pay attention to also. To those who are naturalistically inclined, the attendant fallibility will be but a spur to do better the work which this volume attempts to do. The present volume is an approach, not a closed treatise. So it's not kind of the final word, but it's an approach. It's an attempt to get closer to what inquiry is at present. The aim it hopes to fulfill is that of being a sufficiently coherent and systematic approach to move others to undertake the long cooperative work, never ending in any case as long as inquiry continues, needed to test and fill in the framework which is outlined in this book. So, I also appreciate that idea that this is a cooperative endeavor. And Dewey is part of that, and then we are part of that. So Dewey is part of that, extending ideas of the past, extending ideas of Hume and Locke and Peirce and others, and kind of reinvigorating those in his present moment. And then we, if we take up the challenge, are part of that too, of taking what Dewey accomplished and continuing to kind of readapt that to our present. And I think that's kind of what I'm interested in doing. So last paragraph here. The important matter is that those who reject the doctrine of the intervention of some supernatural agency should not be led by the fact that it is not customary to introduce biological considerations into the discussion of logical theory, to dismiss the chapter as irrelevant. So if you are interested in doing philosophy and doing logic from a non-supernatural perspective, and not everyone is, we have to be honest, there are supernaturalists, and that's fine, but if you are not a supernaturalist, if you're a naturalist, then, don't take so seriously the fact that biology is not so often discussed in logic textbooks, right? I mean, don't feel yourself constrained by that fact, and don't dismiss biological considerations just because it's not always traditionally considered to be worth talking about in the context of logic. It's not irrelevant, Dewey wants to say. Biology is important, right? We are biological creatures. Inquiry is part of what we do as biological creatures. Those who believe in such intervention, in the intervention of supernatural or divine beings, have ground for belief in an a priori reason upon which logical forms and principles depend. They are pre-committed to belief in the irrelevancy of all considerations of the order of those here presented. But any thoroughgoing naturalist is equally committed by the logic of his position to belief in continuity of development, with its corollary of community of factors in the respective patterns of logical and biological forms and procedures. So again, sounds a little complicated. He's basically saying if you are approaching things from a supernaturalist position, then fine. You don't need to worry about biology so much. You can take for granted some a priori reason upon which logical forms and principles depend. But if you're going to be a naturalist, and Dewey's going to be a naturalist, and I'm going to be a naturalist, then you have to take seriously the continuity of nature, and that logic may in fact depend upon biology, logical forms, and procedures may depend on or be grounded in some way upon biological forms and procedures. Okay, and that finishes up our chapter on biology. Next time we're going to take up the cultural matrix of inquiry. But that is all for now.